Ever get sucked into those intense custody battles you see on TV? Where it seems like families are getting ripped apart and accusations are just flying everywhere.
Yeah, those are tough to watch.
Well, we've been diving deep into some research on the work of Dr. Craig Childress, and let me tell you, he says those TV dramas barely scratch the surface.
Oh, absolutely. It's a side of things most people don't really think about unless they're, directly involved. But it's such an important area, especially when you look at the impact these high conflict custody cases have on kids.
And Dr. Childress, he really doesn't shy away from controversy, does he? I mean, he's diving headfirst into the world of parental alienation claims, even going so far as to call out other psychologists for how they're handling these types of cases.
He's definitely not afraid to speak his mind. A
Ah,
really good example of that is this case he worked on that involved the Conscious Co-Parenting Institute.
sure.
I think they go by CCPI.
Okay, CCPI, got it. So what's the story with them?
So they were using this method called the Custody Resolution Method, CRM for short. Basically, imagine taking all these different pieces of information, texts, emails, even court documents, and then analyzing them to look for any kind of patterns that might suggest, that one parent is harming the child.
So it's almost like detective work, but with families instead of,
Yeah.
some crime scene.
Yeah,
Okay.
exactly. That's a great way to put it. And so Dr. Childress, he was brought in as a consultant to analyze some of the data for CCPI. But here's where it gets really interesting. He actually sees the sanctions that were later brought against him by the Oregon Licensing Board as being directly related to this case. Like he sees it as retaliation for his critical views.
Wait, hold on. So he gets penalized for working with CCPI, but he sees it as them basically coming after him for his professional opinions. That's wild.
It's a really tangled web. And to really understand why he sees it that way, we need to kind of dig into his core argument about what he thinks is really going on in these high conflict custody cases, especially when you have a child who's like completely rejecting one parent.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that.
Yeah.
What exactly is Dr. Childress saying?
So Dr. Childress, he comes out swinging with this really strong statement. He's basically saying that when you see a child in a divorce situation who's, totally rejecting one parent, like completely shutting them out,
Yeah.
it almost always points to some form of abuse.
Okay, well, hold up a sec. So he's not just talking about your typical, I don't want to go to dad's kind of kid stuff. We're talking about serious, intense rejection here.
Exactly. We're talking about like a kid who's, physically terrified to even be near the other parent, or a kid who starts making these accusations that are like really out there, really far-fetched. And get this, he actually says that often the wrong parent is the one who gets identified as the abuser.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. How does that even happen? How do you end up with the wrong parent being blamed?
So Dr. Childress, he lays out these two basic scenarios. In the first one, it actually IS the rejected parent who's doing the abusing, right? Which in turn leads to the alienation.
Okay, yeah. That's kind of what most people probably think of first, right? It's that more straightforward scenario.
Right.
One parent is clearly, the bad guy.
Right. But then you've got scenario number two. And this is where it gets, really interesting and complicated. Dr. Childress says that sometimes the parent who seems like the good guy, the one the child is clinging to, they're actually the ones manipulating the whole situation.
Wait, are you saying that the parent who appears to be super loving and supportive could actually be the one who's causing the harm?
That's exactly what Dr. Childress is arguing. He uses this phrase, shared persecutory delusion. Essentially, he's saying that the parent might have this completely distorted view of reality, right? And then they basically pull the child into that delusion with them. They convince the child that the other parent is dangerous, even if there's absolutely no evidence to support that.
So it's almost like they're brainwashing the child, like turning them against the other parent.
Yeah, it can be that intense. And what's really messed up is that he calls this whole manipulation tactic a false attachment pathology. So the child's attachment to that parent, to the allied parent, becomes this way for that parent to control the other parent, to punish them.
Okay, I need an example here. Like, what does this shared persecutory delusion thing actually look like in a real family? Give me like the chilling, ripped from the headlines version.
Okay. Let's say you've got a couple that's splitting up, right?
Right.
And the mom is constantly telling the child that the dad's new apartment, it's in a dangerous neighborhood, that dad can't be trusted to keep them safe. The child, especially if they're younger, they're not going to whip out their phone and be like, hold on, Mom, let me Google Maps this. They're going to believe what their mom is saying. And that fear, it starts to poison their relationship with their dad.
And that's where that false attachment comes
Yeah.
in, right?
Yeah.
Because now the kid is clinging even tighter to the mom, like out of this fear of the dad that's been, basically put there.
Exactly. And the mom might even twist these everyday situations to fit this whole narrative she's created. So let's say dad's running late to pick up the child one day. Instead of being like, oh, honey, maybe there's traffic, the mom might say something like, see, he doesn't really care about you. He'd rather be somewhere else.
Ugh. It's like they're using the child as a pawn in their own messed up game.
Yeah. And Dr. Childress's point is that over time, all these seemingly small incidents, they build up. And they just solidify that delusion in the child's mind, pushing them further and further away from the other parent. And that, he argues, is incredibly damaging.
And this is where Dr. Childress, he kind of shifts his focus to the professionals who are supposed to be helping these families, right? I mean, we're talking about the forensic psychologists who are brought in to do those custody evaluations.
Yeah, and he does not hold back. It's like he's saying a lot of them are walking into these super complex situations with a completely outdated toolbox. Imagine showing up to a smartphone repair job with just a screwdriver and a hammer.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's not going to get you very far.
Exactly. And that's what he's saying. He's like, they don't have the right tools for the job. They don't have the proper training in things like delusional disorders, attachment theory, all that stuff.
So what you're saying is they might see a kid who's genuinely terrified, and they might misinterpret that fear, that rejection, as just parental alienation, when in reality it's something way more complex, maybe even, dangerous.
Exactly. And because they're overlooking all these other possibilities, they end up leaning way too hard on this parental alienation idea, which, by the way, he thinks is often a total misdiagnosis.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit.
Mm.
He keeps coming back to this whole parental alienation thing. What's his issue with it specifically?
So his main argument is that it can actually let the truly harmful parent off the hook. Because if you're only looking for one thing, if you're only looking for a parent bad-mouthing the other parent, you're going to miss all those other subtler signs of manipulation, all those things we were just talking about.
So it's like you're going to the doctor, and they're just assuming every cough is a cold. They're missing all the cases of, pneumonia.
Perfect analogy. And we're not talking about, missing a diagnosis on a head cold here. The stakes are so much higher. We're talking about a child's safety, their entire well-being. Dr. Childress even goes so far as to say that this whole thing, this blind reliance on the parental alienation idea without any real solid scientific backing, it goes against the very ethical standards of psychology.
Wow. So he's not just saying they're a little behind on the research or whatever. He's saying they're actually potentially violating their own professional guidelines.
Yeah.
This is where it gets really frustrating for me, right? Because if what he's saying is true, then why isn't anyone doing anything about it?
Yeah.
Where are the licensing boards in all of this? The people who are supposed to be overseeing all this stuff.
Right. Who's watching the watchers? It's the million-dollar question.
And
this is where Dr. Childress, he suggests that there might be a much bigger, a systemic problem. Because, and get this, he says the licensing boards are often heavily influenced by, wait for it, forensic psychologists.
Oh, come on. Talk about a conflict of interest. That's like the fox guarding the hen house.
Right. It's this crazy cycle where the very people who should be held accountable are the ones who are calling all the shots. And that's a big part of why he's so passionate about all this, about getting this information out there, to raise awareness and to hopefully create some much needed change.
So let me ask you this, because I know people listening to this, they're probably thinking, okay, this is heavy stuff. What advice would you give to someone who's maybe going through a custody battle themselves? It might not be as, extreme as some of the cases we've talked about, but it's still incredibly stressful, emotional. What can they take away from all of this, from Dr. Childress's work?
I think the biggest thing is, knowledge is power. Don't be afraid to do your own research. If you're worried about something, if something doesn't feel right, you have every right to, question a court-appointed evaluator. Ask about their background, their training, their understanding of all these really complex psychological issues.
And if you feel like something's off, like the court's missing something crucial about your family, about the dynamics, don't be afraid to speak up.
Absolutely. This is your child's future we're talking about. You are their advocate, and don't you forget it. Push back, ask for second opinions, and make sure your voice is heard.
This has been, I've got to say, it's been really eye-opening. Dr. Childress, he's a controversial figure, that's for sure, but his work, it brings up some really important questions, especially about how we as a society how we protect children who are caught in the middle of these, really high conflict custody battles. And it makes you wonder, if the very system that's designed to protect these kids, if that system is flawed, where do we even begin to fix it?
That's the challenge, isn't it? But he does offer some potential solutions. He talks about things like mandatory training for anyone who's involved in family court, especially when it comes to these really complex psychological issues. He even suggests a complete overhaul of this whole parental alienation framework.
Right. And let's not forget about his push for things like standardized diagnostic tools, bringing in some actual science to all of this instead of just relying on, someone's gut feeling.
Yeah, it's about making sure that everyone who's involved in these decisions and these life-altering decisions, it's about making sure they're actually equipped to handle how complicated these situations really are.
It's a lot to unpack. And that, dear listener, is what we're hoping you'll do. Don't just, let this deep dive fade into the background noise. Let it spark your curiosity. Maybe you want to, dig a little deeper into Dr. Childress's work. Maybe this has got you thinking about the whole family court system in a whole new way. Whatever it is, just don't stop asking those questions.
Because at the end of the day, awareness is always the first step towards change.
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder all of this. Until next time, keep diving deep.